You know how Stephen King has written some truly unsettling stuff? It, Misery, The Shining. I mean, the guy's basically built a career on keeping people up at night. But there's this one book he wrote that unsettled even him, the king of horror himself. And it unsettled him so much that he almost did not publish it. The book I'm talking about is Pet Sematary. You may be wondering what's up with the misspelling. It is obviously deliberate. It is part of the story, which we will get to in a second. But it is a truly disturbing book that I want to analyze a little bit today. I want to talk about why it's truly so disturbing. And, I will also give you my personal opinion on what I thought about this book. So without further ado, let's get into it. The main inspiration behind this book came from Stephen King's personal life, actually. In the late 70s, Stephen King and his family moved to this house in Orrington, Maine. And the house that they were living in was next to this very busy road. And unfortunately, eventually, Stephen King's daughter, Kat, named Smucky, was hit by a truck on that busy road. Obviously, you should not be letting your cat out, especially if you live next to a busy road. But it's not a video on that issue, so I'm not going to talk about it. This is what happened, and they decided to bury the cat in this pet cemetery that was behind their house. It was made by local kids, hence the misspelling. The pet cemetery was created by just local children, just so that they can have a place to bury their pets, and just so they can grieve and remember their loved pets. They decided to bury their cat in that cemetery, and there was this handmade cross that his daughter made, and it read, "Smucky, he was obedient." And Stephen King was laughing years later that he was not obedient because he was obviously a cat. But yeah, obviously his daughter loved this cat, so it was a very sad situation. Sometime later, another very scary situation happened. So Stephen King also had a son, and one time when he was playing, he almost got run over the same way their cat got run over. Thank God there was no accident, nothing actually happened to this child. But obviously, it definitely scared Stephen King himself quite a lot, and it also got him thinking about all the terrible scenarios that could have happened. Smucky made it into the book and both movies. That grave marker is in all of them. Your daughter would have been around 9 or 10 then. How did she take this loss? That night after we buried it, we heard her out in the garage. She was jumping up and down on those popper things they rub fragile stuff in. She was shouting, "God can't have my cat. That cat is my cat. Let him have his own cat." And I put all that in the book, and yeah, we were in a field and there really was a busy road there when Owen wandered too close. Everything in the book up to the point of the supernatural stuff is true. So out of all these experiences, there was just all these what if questions that formed in Stephen King's mind. So, something like, what if the cemetery could bring pets back? What if there was another burial ground beyond it? Something darker, something tied to the legend of the Wendigo. But you imagined another more ancient burial ground further in the woods that brings things back to life. I always wondered why you separated them instead of simply having the pet cemetery resurrect them. I thought, well, you can't do that or they would all come back. But what if there was another graveyard beyond it? And I read some book about the Wendigo, which is an evil spirit that possesses people and drives them to cannibalism. And I kind of folded that into it. Okay, so now that we know what real life events inspired this book. Let's talk about the actual plot of this book. At the center of Pet Sematary is Louis Creed, a doctor who accepts a job at the University of Maine, and because of this new job, he decides to move with his family. So his wife Rachel, his daughter Ellie, and their toddler son Gage, and also their family cat Church, they decide to move to this small town in Maine. Their new house looks basically perfect. It's big, spacious, cozy, but there is a catch. Right beyond their property, there is this very busy highway where trucks speed by day and night. So it is a very dangerous road. Also, behind their house, there is like a narrow path that leads to this clearing that is marked by makeshift graveyards and this sign that basically says Pet Sematary, misspelled by local children who have been burying their pets in that area for decades, basically. So basically, the person who tells them about this Pet Sematary is their elderly neighbor named Judd. He kind of like becomes friends with the family, especially with Judd. They like to just sit together at the porch and have a beer together and talk about different things. So the family is slowly settling in. Louis starts his new job. Ellie goes to new school. Rachel is taking care of their kid and everything. But their peace doesn't last long, because one day when Louis is alone at home, he gets a phone call from the neighbor, Judd. And it turns out that their family cat, Church, was hit by a truck and it passed away. This is kind of when Judd starts to reveal that Pet Sematary isn't the end of the story, that beyond Pet Sematary there is another burial ground, one that is steeped in dark legend and one that is whispered to hold the power to like bring back the dead. And that night, Judd and Louis go to that burial place together, and Louis ends up burying his daughter's cat in that place. The next day, the cat comes back, but he comes back different. That's the point. He comes back different. He's just not the same. He feels a bit sluggish. He feels really strange. He smells of earth. He's just not the same cat anymore. I feel like from that moment on, the novel shifts, because Louis now lives with this knowledge that death may not be final. And he's a doctor. Obviously he's a man of science, but now he has seen with his own eyes that his daughter's cat came back to life. So later, when he's struck with yet another tragedy, this knowledge will become a temptation. And he will start thinking, if death isn't the end, then maybe, just maybe, loss can be undone. And that's the heartbeat of Pet Sematary. A family who seem ordinary, relatable, even happy, forced to face grief and the unimaginable choices that grief might push someone to make. So as the novel moves into its second half, another tragedy strikes the Creed family. And this is where King takes this story from like eerie to just truly devastating. So Louis has already seen what the burial ground does. So it can bring back the dead, but the dead come back changed. And Judd has warned him multiple times about this burial ground. Yes, he did tell him about it when his daughter's cat died. so that he could bury the cat and get it back. But he specifically told him that you should never ever bury a human there, that you should not, because what comes back is not human. He even says this famous line, "Sometimes dead is better." Lewis was warned multiple times that you should not be burying a human there. But when Lewis loses his baby son, he doesn't listen to reason. He's so overwhelmed with grief that all reasonable thoughts just don't make sense. All he wants to do is to bring his boy back, and he thinks that this is the only way to get him back. He does not care about the consequences. He thinks that everything will be okay, that he can get his son back. I mean, that's a true horror of the Pet Sematary. It's not the supernatural forces in the woods, but the way grief can silence reason and just twist love into something destructive. King even explained in an interview, when you lose somebody, you go through that feeling of, they were just here yesterday. Couldn't they just come back? That's the other thing about Pet Sematary. When I read it over, I thought, there's such grief in this book, just awful. Okay, so why did Stephen King fear this book? Why was he so disturbed by it? Because, he obviously wrote many disturbing books, but why was this one so particularly disturbing to him? Probably just the subject of it being dark, and also, like I said, a lot of it was inspired by events from his own life, so I think in a way, maybe it just was personal to him. I've got this excerpt from an interview. So Stephen King said, "I read it over and I said to myself, this is awful. This is really terrible. Not that it was badly written necessarily, but all that stuff about the death of kids, it was close to me because my kids lived on that road." This book does talk about this very heavy topic of children's death, and I think this book is even more disturbing because of what happens after. If you've read the book, what happens after the child's death. The events take a really, really crazy, really disturbing turn. But also the grief of a parent. It was such a heavy read from that perspective. Writing this must have been so difficult because even though he hasn't lost his children, he probably was imagining it. What if my son had been hit on the road? What if I was like Lewis? What if I was grieving the loss of my child right now? So I think even though this book contains some supernatural elements, I think it was not the supernatural elements that really shook King. I think what made Pet Sematary different from other books that he had written before was how it confronted something that people instinctively recoil from, which is the death of a child. I mean, it is one of the darkest things imaginable, both in literature and in real life. And, I guess we can stomach stories about ghosts or killers. But the idea of losing a child, or worse, trying to undo that loss and twisting it into something unnatural, is the kind of horror that definitely hits close home to any parent. I'm not even a parent myself, but I could definitely imagine the horror of that. Even if you're not a parent, I think just imagining that you are losing a loved one is enough to make this book scary and disturbing. And for King, I think it was more than just imagination. I think it's just the fact that he had lived beside that road that killed his daughter's cat and almost took his son's life as well. So, you know, he felt like that fear wasn't abstract. He felt like it was a real fear and it lived just outside his front door. So probably when he finished the manuscript, he maybe felt like it was just too much. It was too raw, too personal. Maybe he thought that maybe this book is a bit too dark to publish. But the real parts are why you held off publishing, why it bothered you. The kids were home a lot. All you had to do is just go to the Pet Sematary and see what the road did. You know, it wasn't much of a leap. And here's another interview where King talked about this book. He says, it was so gruesome by the end of it and so awful. I mean, there's no hope for anybody at the end of that book. Usually I give my drafts to my wife Tabby to read, but I didn't give it to her. When I finished, I put it in the desk and just left it there. I worked on Christine, which I liked a lot better and which was published before Pet Sematary. So now you may be thinking, why was it published then? Well, okay, so basically he had like a long-term deal with his publisher, and this deal tied up his royalties in a fund the publisher controlled. And in order to break free of that, he needed to provide the publisher one more manuscript. I don't know, I'm guessing maybe the only manuscript that was available to him at the time was Pet Sematary. So he dug it up from his drawer and he decided to publish it because he needed some manuscript to break free of his deal. Is it also true the only reason you finally published Pet Sematary was to settle a book contract? That's what happened. That's the reason I published the book. Otherwise, it would still be in a drawer somewhere. I think if you're interested in reading a horror that's not necessarily about like monsters, and it's not necessarily about like fast-paced action and all of that. It's more about just grief and human choices, and it's the type of story that will just leave you unsettled long after you finish it. It's reading this book is like staring into the dark and asking what if. So if you are looking for a disturbing type of novel like this, then I can definitely recommend it. In my personal opinion, it is a bit too slow. I just feel like there was a lot of rambling that just could have been easily cut out because it didn't add much to the storyline. Personally, if I was the editor of this book, I would just cut out so much of the rambling that I felt like didn't add much to the story. But that's just my own personal opinion. I still think it was a very well written horror story. It definitely builds up the tension very slowly. It is a very terrifying and disturbing novel. It's definitely not for everyone. Like I said, it is dark. Other than that, I can still recommend it. Like the characters, they are like really flawed and complicated and painfully real, which I think is just what makes the story even more relatable and even more terrifying in a way. I've read this like almost 2 months ago, but I still think about this book all the time. That's how much it unsettled me. It definitely makes you think a lot about life and death and everything. So if you do want like a very disturbing, slow-paced horror, then I can recommend Pet Sematary. In the comments below, let me know whether you've read this book, whether you're planning to read it, or maybe you're planning to never read it because it's just too dark for you. Just let me know what you think of this book. That's it for this video, guys. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!